here with Dr. Cora Marrett. She is the Deputy Director of the National Science Foundation. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Marrett.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about your background and how you started at NSF.
I've been at the National Science Foundation this is my fifth year. I've been in the role of deputy for 3 of those 5 years. I came to the foundation to lead the education and human resources part of NSF on leave from my academic appointment at the University of Wisconsin. That's been my affiliation for any number of years. I had been at the foundation 15 years earlier, heading up what is the directorate for the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And that's basically then my brief history of the foray into the National Science Foundation.
Your background is in sociology, right?
Yes, I am. I'm a social scientist.
So tell us, why is STEM education so important? We hear a lot about this in the news, almost every day. So why do we care? Why is it important?
I'd start with the idea of what's the importance of science and engineering to the nation. And they're important for the innovation that they bring. As we try to think about the development of the human potential and the development of the economy, innovation, especially in science and engineering, play key roles there. If we are not preparing another generation to be the innovators, then we're at a loss. We're at a loss because we won't be developing the talent that's going to be needed for people to realize their full potential, and we won't be developing the talent that the nation needs. This then is a part of a worldwide development that focuses a lot on making sure that we have that talent development for the innovation, for the expansion that's very necessary. So STEM education, or education in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that's a very important phenomenon to be undertaken in our schools, in our cities, and generally in the United States.
So I've seen an interview where you spoke a little bit about how the nature of our society is one that's only going to grow through innovation, that a lot of our sort of growing space is going to be through the use of these in these fields. Can you tell us a little bit about that theory?
Yes, the U.S. was, of course, at one point a heavily agricultural society. We moved later to being heavily manufacturing. Even though manufacturing is coming back, it's a different kind of manufacturing that's dependent very much on new modes, new technologies. So it can't be manufacturing in the sense that it once was. We need then the people who are not just being able to use the machinery, but who are developing the innovative ways to produce that machinery. The same thing occurs in the agricultural world. The reason that we can have fewer people in agriculture has to do with the advances made in the production of food. So all of that says what we really are seeing is that the future is very much tied up with what we're calling the new areas of development. And those are the new skills relying on ideas, relying on the brain in so many ways. That's what we're seeking to develop. So the hands will not be as significant for the future of this nation as once was the case. And thus, our science, that's why we emphasize science and engineering for innovation, for the new ways for doing things, the creative ways. That's what the emphasis is on and why it's important for the future of our nation.
So it seems like almost every week we hear about a new study that tells how much farther behind American students are compared to their peers in other countries in these fields. Why do you think that is?
I have to look at that in a couple of ways. Based on a number of the measures, and those usually are the measures of performance on standardized tests. Yes, our students don't do as well. If, however, even for those tests, we take the students at the top ranges, our students are as competitive as students anywhere in the world. We know we've got a much more diverse population than a lot of nations. Let me give you the example of the nation that ranks at the top, Finland. there was a set of visitors from the Finnish parliament, and I asked them, how is it that Finland comes out so well in any of the kinds of national comparisons? Well, admittedly, they started out boasting. They said, of course, we're good. And they went on to talk about what they do in terms of teacher preparation. So teacher preparation there means you're at the master's level before you move into teaching. But then they went on to say, but think about the Finnish society. It's a pretty small and not very diverse society. They said, that's in contrast to the size of the US population, to the variation in the US population. So we always have to take that into account. I don't want to make excuses, however, because I was also very interested in the kinds of things taking place in Norway, a country that has a lot of advances, but really is not ahead of the US in terms of the standardized test. My question there was, well, what do you say, how do you explain that? They said it has a lot to do with what we emphasize in the education world. It's not the performance on standardized tests. We want to cultivate that kind of innovativeness. We want to cultivate the creativity. And that's not always what the examinations will test for. So I always have mixed reactions. On the one hand, saying, yes, we can get our students up to perform as well as anybody in the world, and we have some who do that. But on the other hand, our educational system is often the envy of other places in the world because it fosters so much more of the creativity and innovativeness. We have other countries coming to visit us to ask, how is it that you're producing the innovators that we're not? So it's a rather mixed bag, if I can put it that way, for what the educational world looks like. I don't ever want to say that there are no problems, because there are. But at the same time, we don't want to eliminate some of the features that really are very strong assets for our nation.
So in that same vein, at least in this country, you don't find as many women going into these fields. It's getting a lot better. I noticed a statistic that something like 43% of PhDs in these fields are awarded to women, but that they don't stay in the fields. Could you talk a little bit about the gender discrepancy?
Yes, the participation by gender varies so much from one field to another. In the case of biology, the rates are high, and I'm talking about the PhD level especially. In most of the social sciences and in psychology, the rates are high. In other fields, computer science, and most parts of engineering, the rates are very low. Why these are the circumstances, there are lots of different explanations that have been given, supported by research. One of them has to do with the idea of the attractiveness of fields. In those cases, if you take the life sciences, the social sciences, where it's easier often to show the linkages to addressing larger societal or personal problems, they have tended to be more attractive to women. But then it seems as if it's a series of things, often in the colleges, that lead people, women who start out in the fields, don't find these very supportive environments often. So one of the concerns we have has to do with the withdrawal from the fields, not so much the preparation to even consider fields, but patterns are changing. And from the angle of the National Science Foundation, we're still trying to understand much more fully what are those patterns and how are patterns altered.
Another sort of prevailing, maybe it's prevailing myth, but the idea that sciences and math are hard. How do we fix that? I think a lot of children go into school hearing that from their parents and respond accordingly.
One of my favorite stories comes from someone who had run a computer camp for young children. And after that camp, the students were back in a classroom. The teacher asked, how many of you know a little bit about computers? Lots of hands went up. How many of you know a lot about computers? Well, there weren't not quite as many hands. He said, how many know a lot? Almost no hands. And there was one little girl whose hand never went up. He asked her, "What is it? Why didn't you answer?" She said, "You didn't ask who's an expert on computers." And that confidence had come from what she'd experienced in the camp. So the part of this, the same reason that's been given for why in many places algebra is taught in the very lowest grades, because there are no assumptions made at that point about what is hard and what's not all that hard. So there are messages often delivered that do carry with them the sense that, oh yes, this is going to be very difficult. That there are people who say, consider, it's acceptable for someone to say, I'm not good at math. But who is regarded as acceptable? They said, I'm not good at reading. And it should be somewhat the same notion. Finally on it, there is an idea that what can happen in schools is that there is far more acceptance in a lot of US classrooms for the student who's struggling in math, the view being, well, you probably are not that good. And that also does not help very much at all. There are other cultures in which the notion is, you're struggling, we're going to help you get through, because everybody can do whatever is required there. So these kinds of expectations, the kinds of reinforcements, all seem to be extremely important for how people regard what they can, what they want to do.
So how do we go about increasing expectations for young kids in math and science?
One of the things, and I've been struck by this for a number of years, some of those are already changing. Many, many years ago, I had an undergraduate at University of Wisconsin who was in engineering, and she wanted to do a senior thesis, and she chose to do it on women in engineering. She'd never even heard that there were issues about women's participation in engineering. She started reading that literature. She says, this is fascinating. So some of the things where assumptions had been made, they're not there anymore. For the reason why I think a lot of things are changing for women in science in general, and in math in particular, there's been a movement for years now to think of what one has to do to correct the kind of imbalances. So what can we do? We can do a lot of things by focusing on the successes that have been achieved, understanding better why those successes, and making sure that the opportunities actually do continue.
So you just spoke at an Arizona State University panel called Why Are We Losing Our Humanity? And it was all about the importance of the humanities in modern society. And I'm wondering what you see as the relationship between sort of hard sciences and the humanities in our culture and in our society.
Let me start with the topic of the conference, because when I agreed to do it, then I said, what in the world am I going to address? Then I had to look at what I thought was going on, because it said about are we losing our humanity? And I said, okay, if humanity means humaneness, compassion, that's one way for looking at it. But the other, I think, is about the humanities as areas of study, areas in which there is learned experiences or learned attention to the human condition. So in terms of the latter, this kind of humanities, the sorts of connections that are there are numbers of connections. And let me cross all of the sciences. I have to start first by saying, when I talk about science, I'm talking about a mode of investigation, of doing work that's systematic, that can be replicated. And so it doesn't really matter what area one is examining. And that's why we can talk about systematic work that looks at the world of nature, at the universe. It looks at life. It looks at the engineered or designed world. And it looks at the world of human behavior. All of that is what we mean by science at the National Science Foundation. Now, in that context, then, the issue of the humanities, there are strong linkages between the kind of areas, the learned areas concerned with the human condition, and those areas concerned with looking systematically at whatever parts of the worlds we're talking about. Among the connections that one of the things that I say about many of the sciences, science in general, is very much about human curiosity. We're curious about the universe. We're curious about the oceans, about life, about human behavior. And that then says the humanities share that interest, but approach it very systematically to unravel some complexities about the human condition. Thus, one of my key points is that there are areas of substantial overlap between science, the sciences, and the humanities. And I saw the conference that's just been completed as an extraordinary way for us to think more about the linkages and to ask, are there artificial barriers that have been imposed that don't let us think as closely as we should about all of our concerns being around the human condition? Science and the National Science Foundation is first and foremost about improving the human society, improving the condition. That's not all that different from what the humanities are concerned about. We just need more opportunities for sharing our common concerns.
So with what you said earlier about science moving our society forward, how can those two different sort of fields or different types of science work together?
Well, I would hope, I like to think of all of knowledge as coming together and moving things forward. In one way, it's an artificial distinction that's been made in the US when it comes to knowledge. There are other countries in which the National Research Organization, the National Science Foundation covers all fields of knowledge. So it wouldn't be a distinction between science and humanities. Everything is there in this way that things are connected. So my idea is that even though we have the separate mandate, we have to then think of the collaborative ways, because whether it's the National Science Foundation as one of the federal agencies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, we share this concern with enhancing the human condition, and the human condition, especially for our populations. The question becomes, how do we work much more collaboratively to illuminate what's possible? We do have some connections we want to enhance, and I saw the meeting today as offering me some opportunities and ideas for some things I can say we will work on together.